When you're trying to decide whether a full-size rack belongs in your home lab, the biggest fear is ending up with something that looks impressive on the wall, but becomes a constant source of frustration. You wonder if the extra square footage will actually translate into easier cable management, better cooling, and a setup that grows with you, or if you'll be stuck with a box that's too shallow, too noisy, or simply a waste of money. I've spent the last few weeks watching a handful of folks set up their own server closets, reading through the threads where they complain about heat spikes and cramped drive bays, and then I walked through a couple of local maker spaces to see how people actually use a rack of this size. If you're on the fence about a 42-unit, floor-standing enclosure, the experience I'm about to share should help you judge the real value, the everyday usability, and whether it truly fits the kind of gear you plan to mount. The link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First, let's talk about the kind of environment where this cabinet shines. The unit is a 19-inch tall, 39-inch deep steel frame with a tempered glass front. That depth isn't a random number, it's enough to slide a 4U NAS chassis, or a 2U router stack with a bit of breathing room for cable bends. In the makerspace I visited, one member had a couple of 4U storage servers, a small rack mount UPS, and a handful of POS switches. He tucked all of those into a rack of similar dimensions, and the extra depth meant the front fans on his NAS could pull air straight through the rack without being forced into a tight tunnel. The result was a noticeable dip in his temperature logs, especially during the evening when the ambient room was cooling down. That's a concrete example of how the deep rack with active airflow claim actually translates into lower component temps in a real-world scenario. The heavy-duty load capacity is another practical win. The frame is built from reinforced steel, and the spec sheets say it can hold a static load of several hundred pounds. In practice, that means you can stack a couple of 8-drive NAS units, a 1U firewall, and still have a few pounds to spare for future expansion. I saw a home lab enthusiast who started with a single 2U router and later added a 4U media server. He never had to worry about sagging shelves or the rack bowing under the weight, which is a common complaint with cheaper aluminum frames that start to droop after a month of full drives. The steel construction gives you peace of mind that the cabinet won't become a structural hazard the moment you add a 40 terabyte storage array. Now, the glass door. It's a nice aesthetic touch. You can actually see the blinking lights, the cable bundles, and the status LEDs without opening the front. That visibility is useful for quick troubleshooting. In the space I toured, a network admin was able to glance at the rack from across the room and spot a failed drive lead before it became a critical failure. The lockable mechanism also means you can keep the front panel shut when you have kids or pets roaming around, which is a small but real safety feature. However, the glass does have a trade-off. When you close the door, you lose a bit of direct airflow, so you'll rely more heavily on the built-in fans to pull hot air out the rear. The included fans are decent, but they aren't industrial grade. In a densely packed rack with several high-power servers, you'll likely need to add a supplemental exhaust fan or place the cabinet in a well-ventilated corner. The built-in 8-outlet power distribution unit, PDU, is where the rear deploy promise starts to feel genuine. You can plug the rack's main cord into a single wall outlet, then cascade power to each piece of gear without hunting for a separate strip for every device. One reviewer I chatted with mentioned that the PDU saved him a few feet of cable and eliminated a tangle of power bricks on the floor. The PDU is fused and has an on and off switch, so you can shut down the entire rack with one click, handy when you need to reboot everything after a firmware update. The downside? The PDU is rated for a total load of about 1500 W. If you plan to run a handful of 500 W servers plus a power-hungry NAS, you'll be flirting with that limit. In that scenario, you'd need to either upgrade the PDU or feed the rack from a dedicated circuit. The fixed shelf inside the cabinet is a modest but practical feature. It's positioned just behind the front door, giving you a place to mount a small 1U switch, a patch panel, or a compact UPS. Because the shelf is locked to the frame, you can't just slide a device out and lose alignment, you have to unscrew it, which adds a little extra security. For anyone who wants a tidy, Satin forget look, that's a plus. If you're the type who constantly rearranges gear,